The veil on Canada's pandemic finances.
Our plan will continue to support Canadians through the pandemic and ensure that the post-COVID economy is robust, inclusive, and sustainable.
18 months since the last federal budget.
I want to see a plan for getting Canadians working, helping some sectors like tourism and others that are on the edge of the brink.
If we want to get through this difficult time, it should not be on the backs of people who've already sacrificed. We should ask those at the very top to pay their fair share.
Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland delivers the federal fiscal update. Join us for live coverage and expert analysis. Welcome to the Global News live coverage of the Economic and Fiscal Update 2020. This is a long-awaited update on the health of federal finances. We're keeping a close eye on the House of Commons right now to see just when Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland will enter the House to give her update. That will happen after the markets close. The fall economic statement should have a full accounting of pandemic spending, and so far, the depth of this year's deficit, which in July was forecast to hit a historic $343.2 billion. Estimates vary on just how deep the deficits will go today as the Liberals prepare to unveil that. A Scotiabank report on Friday said that the range of the possible deficit could go as high as $400 to $450 billion, given the government's minimal reporting so far and mixed political signals. Joining us now in advance of the big announcement is Sahir Khan. He is the Executive Vice President at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa and also formerly of the Parliamentary Budget Office. Thank you so much for joining us, Sahir. We've been waiting a long time for this fiscal update. We haven't had a budget this year. In the record year of spending, the most stimulus spending, the most government spending we have seen since the Second World War. We don't know how much we've spent. Do you think that we're going to get a full accounting of that today, and what are you expecting to see?
Well, I think, as you know, Mercedes, this is a big event from a transparency and accountability perspective, just because we haven't had a budget in 18 months. So there's a lot at stake for the government's credibility with citizens, with Parliament, but also with the financial markets. I think the second thing that what we're kind of anticipating out of this is hopefully, at the minimum, like an accounting of what went on. I think if we were going to give them higher grades, what we're hoping to see is some scenarios of what the future might look like, and not just a minimum of a 1 or 2 year.
My apologies. I'm going to jump in right there just for a moment because the finance minister has risen now in the House of Commons. So we're just going to go very quickly to her so we can actually start talking about what is, in fact, in this. But before we do that, our David Aiken, chief political correspondent, has prepared a package for us with all the highlights. He's been inside the embargo, reading these documents. Take a listen to what the fall fiscal update includes.
For her first fiscal update as finance minister, Chrystia Freeland will set a record, notching up deficits like no government in Canada ever has. Before the pandemic, this year's deficit was likely to be just $34 billion. But by July, Ottawa was forecasting a deficit 10 times as big, at $343 billion. Now, Freeland says this year's deficit will likely clock in at about $382 billion. All of that will add to the national debt, boosting it from $741 billion, that was the forecast before the pandemic, to more than $1.1 trillion. The reason is simple. It is costing billions for COVID-19 related support programs already in place, and now there's an extra $25 billion in spending this year alone. There will be a boost, for example, to the Canada Child Benefit of up to $1,200 per child under the age of 6. This will be means tested and available only for low and middle-income families. Ottawa will also set up a new lending program for tourist businesses, airlines, hotels, and other firms hard hit by the pandemic. Loans will be available up to $1 million on a 10-year term at ultra-low rates, all 100% backed by the government. The provinces will split an extra $1 billion, which they can use to improve long-term care facilities. And those crucial business support programs like the emergency rent subsidy and the wage subsidy have been locked in until June 21st. And the government has boosted the wage subsidy to 75%. That's up from 60%. Freeland's fiscal statement also lays some markers for future spending on pharmacare and childcare, but does not commit to major spending now on either of those files. But Freeland does say that starting next year, the government will spend between $70 to $100 billion a year for each of 3 years in a row on economic recovery projects. Details of that spending will be announced later and would conceivably add to future deficits. The political debate now will be, can the country afford all this spending? Freeland says yes, but more importantly, she'll make the argument Canada can't afford not to spend all of that money. David Aiken, Global News, Ottawa.
Healthy and safe. Young children diligently wear masks for hours every day in school, knowing they are helping to protect their grandparents. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are doing their part. It's only right that we, in this House, do ours. By ensuring the economy that comes after this pandemic is more innovative, inclusive, and resilient than the one that preceded it. From the onset of COVID-19, our government has done everything in our power to combat the virus and mitigate its harm using every tool available.
8 out of every $10 spent in Canada to fight the virus and support Canadians has been spent by the federal government. To date, the government has procured more than 2 billion pieces of PPE, and we have assembled a comprehensive, world-leading portfolio of vaccines. The government has invested more than $1 billion in vaccine agreements, securing a domestic supply of up to 429 million doses of 7 promising vaccines, more than 10 doses for every Canadian. In fact, Mr. Speaker, Canada has secured the most diverse and extensive vaccine portfolio of any country in the world. Every Canadian can rest assured that a safe and effective vaccine will be available to them free of charge. The battle against COVID-19 has proceeded on many fronts. We have invested in healthcare, increased testing and tracing, and directly supported provinces and territories as they fight the virus. This has been a Team Canada effort.
Total support so far includes $322 billion in direct measures to fight the virus and help people, and $85 billion in tax and duty deferrals. Mr. Speaker, this is the largest economic relief package.
That is Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland unveiling the government's pandemic spending plan. There still has not been a federal budget in the year 2020, a year of historic spending. But today we were able to see the over 200-page document in which the federal government revealed the deficit so far, which comes out to $382 billion, putting us at $1.1 trillion in debt, and revealing their plan forward. It's a document that mainly focuses on the immediate term, looking at pandemic spending and expanding and increasing the length of time that existing programs are ready. It seems that the federal Liberals are saving their political firepower for some of their bigger programs like childcare and pharmacare that likely won't won't be included until the the spring budget. It also says in this particular document that the Liberals have a $100 billion program ready to go once they believe the economy is ready for stimulus. But they're not saying when that will be or how exactly they'll decide when to launch it. There is also important to note no fiscal anchor anywhere in this fall fiscal update. Instead, the government says they will use what they call fiscal guardrails to determine when to start and stop stimulus programs. And that will include things like hours worked and the unemployment rate in this country. Let's go now back to Sahir Khan, who sadly we had to jump out of you there for a moment, Sahir. The finance minister on time. Often they're not. So we went straight to her and we went to that package. You've heard a little bit now about what is in this budget. Not this budget. It's the closest thing we've had to the budget. What we have in this fall fiscal update. What stood out to you?
Well, I think right off the bat, what we're hearing is, while there aren't explicit fiscal anchors in this package, the minister's starting to articulate constraints that any new measures coming in support of an economic recovery appear to be time limited, as does the support. So all of a sudden, I think we're shifting from, the taps are wide open to now we're going to start to put some constraints on the system. I think that's new. I also think that they're starting to think about impact and results of the spending. I understand that, internally there was a committee formed to start to look at the results from existing spending to figure out, when do the taps start to get turned off and are these measures effective? So a bit of a change in tone in the government. And it sounds like we're at least getting that accounting we were looking for in terms of how this kind of historic level of spending was done to support this economy and Canadians.
What do you make of this $382 billion deficit? Is that lower than you were expecting on the lower range? I mean, I know some projections had it going as high as $450 billion. It seems like the Liberals have either not had the programs accessed as much or maybe overshot how high it could go and aren't spending as much as some thought they might, given the opportunity here.
Yeah, this is a tough environment for forecasting, whether you're the government or you're an analyst on the outside. I don't think we would have been surprised at the IFSD, but anything that would come in under, around the $400 billion mark. So 380 doesn't really surprise us from that point of view. I think I'll have to certainly go through the document and see where the money went and the extent to which these can actually, be effectively kind of turned off at the right time. At the right moment when the economy can start to carry itself.
What do you think of using what they're calling those fiscal guardrails, things like hours worked and the unemployment rate, versus saying, okay, this is going to be our hard ceiling and our hard floor? And by the way, I should say for our viewers at home, if you're wondering why we're not disclosing exactly what numbers they're going to use on things like hours worked or the employment rate, it's because they're not disclosing that at this point. So we don't have a sense really of where that might be. Do you think that that's a reasonable way, Sahir, of proceeding in an environment where there's still just a lot of uncertainty?
Well, I think we can only go by what the minister said so far, and I think this is the beginning of starting to put constraints on the system, and that's the kind of the messaging I get out of the minister and kind of from the tone of the words. But I think a system like this needs constraints, but also needs to focus on results. So I think the focus going forward should be on the quality of spending, and what kind of outcomes are we getting, and if they're keeping one eye on those results, then I think they'll be in a better position to know whether they should either increase spending, reduce it, or change the instruments that they're using to either respond to the pandemic or to encourage a recovery afterwards.
One of the things that I noticed when I was leafing through this 270-odd page document is that there are some graphs and charts where the government is showing and demonstrating their argument that direct support works. And they're arguing we could have seen unemployment go as much as 6% higher had there not been direct supports to individuals and to businesses to mitigate this, that there in fact was a very quick recovery when, back in the days we were all enjoying those relief of COVID numbers around July and August. Of course, that's changing now that we are in a second wave, but the recovery and bounce back was quite quick because people had money in their bank accounts. In fact, one of the interesting things they note in this is a very unusual recession in the sense that a significant number of Canadian households actually have more savings now than they did going into this, and that propelled part of the recovery because they were able to spend, they were willing to go out to retailers, they had money saved up. So they're arguing that these direct supports, in fact, clearly work and are successful. What do you make of that?
I think they have the right to make that claim. And, our own analysis here at the FSD suggests that this recession would have been a lot deeper had the government not intervened to the extent that it did. I think the next phase, though, is going to be look at kind of the quality of that spending to figure out, were the tools deployed in an optimal way? Can they make mid-course corrections? And can they spend better? And I don't think anyone's going to fault them for the type of reaction they did in the midst of a crisis. I think there was no sense at that time of what the right measures were precisely and the quantum of money. So I think now this is a good time for them to take a breather between now and the budget to think about how well are these instruments performing, and going forward, can we start to put guardrails and maybe more detail around these scenarios to figure out when those taps can start to get turned off and replaced by measures that actually support economic recovery, so that the federal treasury and the coffers of Canadian citizens are filled by a productive economy.
Well, and I think that there's certainly some interesting reflections in this budget where you can see certain programs that clearly they believe are working, that they're doubling down on, like, for example, the wage subsidy, something that they really think has worked, the rent subsidy, looking at increasing the amounts in some of those programs. I do want to come back to you, Sahir, in just a few moments, but I want to talk to the panel of economists we've also assembled to walk us through some of what is, in fact, in this document and what it means for Canadians at home. So I think we can go now to Trevin Staton. He is the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. He's able to give us the business perspective on this. And we also have David McDonald from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives on the program. Trevin, I want to start with you. We talked about sectoral supports, I believe, in advance of this, and we were all curious about whether or not we would see it for people at home. There are, in fact, sectoral supports. It is dealing specifically with the airline industry, although some of those will be tied to Canadians getting refunds. And there's quite a bit of money in here potentially for tourism, for hotels, for restaurants. These have been the hardest hit industries in the government's documents here. They're showing charts, and the people who really are not regaining employment, the businesses that are not bouncing back are those, because people aren't traveling the same way or conducting tourism on public health advice during COVID. What do you make of the commitment to some of these sectoral supports?
Well, certainly the business community has been calling for a sector-specific package for those hardest-hit sectors. I mean, really what we're seeing right now is what economists like me call a K-shaped recovery, where certain sectors have been able to adapt through technology or other means to the pandemic, while other sectors that almost rely on physical presence for their business models to work aren't faring as well, like in restaurants or arts and entertainment or retail, and specifically the airlines. So having a sector-specific package is very important, both to support businesses and also for fiscal sustainability of the government's plan too. I think what might be concerning for some of those businesses is that a lot of it is in loans. And these businesses have been through a lot over the past few months through the first wave, now going into or in the middle of a second wave in many parts of the country. A lot of them don't necessarily have the ability to take on more debt right now. And so, we certainly appreciate that. I'm sure those businesses that are able to take on more debt will be able to make use of it. But many of those businesses that are almost looking at permanent closures right now might not be able to get access to the type of funding that they need.
What was your thought in here about the funding in particular for small businesses? And I'm thinking especially about the programs that are being increased, things like the wage subsidy, which have been very popular, and the rent program as well. That at one point in this document, it claims that between federal government supports alone, some businesses could see 90% of their rent paid off. Will that be enough?
Yeah. That is certainly useful. I mean, particularly for the restaurant sector, I think that is very much appreciated. And I know that all businesses have really been looking for more details about the wage subsidy because we only had details until the end of December up until this point. That being said, there are still, some areas for improvement when it comes to, for instance, commercial rent. Some of the larger franchises that almost operate their individual locations as small businesses might not have access to the subsidy, or there might actually still be a cap on what they're able to access. And so there are still some gaps to fill, but it's certainly appreciated by a number of small businesses.
What would be the most important thing for small businesses that if you are worried about whether you can survive this second wave and you're digging through this fiscal update, is there going to be a feeling of relief that there is enough here to stop a second wave of significant insolvency?
I mean, it's definitely going to be very helpful for a number of businesses, and it's certainly an improvement over the existing programs that were in place that were already helpful as well. I think what a lot of small businesses are most looking for is a national COVID strategy to be proactive about the pandemic itself, to be able to get it under control, to be able to get better data, and to be able to get consistency on when lockdowns are taking place and how that's going to take place. And so we're still looking for that. I imagine that those might be some things that we would see looking forward into a federal budget next year, as well as an actual full-scale economic recovery plan.
Well, and speaking of that, let's go back now just to the House of Commons. The finance minister still speaking, delivering this. We'll get some more details from her on exactly what the thinking is behind this document and what else you can expect. And we'll talk about that in the rest of the program too, because there's some money going into Canadians' pockets in all of this that I think a number of families will be keen to hear about.
Of some Canadians and on the backs of some businesses. Our growth plan will foster economic rebirth in the short term and strengthen this country's competitiveness in the long run. Today, we are presenting a down payment on this plan. These are measures we can begin safely taking now. They include investments in the green economy and job training, particularly for youth and care providers. Rural broadband, airport infrastructure, rapid housing, economic empowerment for vulnerable communities, and measures to immediately build up our health and social infrastructure. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker,
nous savons que la
we know
compétitivité
that Canada's future
future du Canada
competitiveness
dépend de
depends
notre
on our ability
capacité
to take
de
advantage
tirer
of the
parti
net
de
zero green
l'économie
economy.
verte à zéro émission nette. Notre plan de
Our
croissance
growth
doit
plan must continue to advance
de
our
nous
progress
aider à faire
on climate
avancer
action
notre lutte contre les changements climatiques et à promouvoir
and
une
promote
économie
a clean economy.
propre. Nous allons planter 2 milliards
We will
d'arbres
plant
au
2
cours
billion
des
trees
10 prochaines années.
over the next 10 years.
Accorder 700 000
Provide
subventions pour
700,000
aider les
grants to help
propriétaires de
homeowners
maisons
make
à
energy-efficient
effectuer des
retrofits
rénovations éco-énergétiques et construire
and
des bornes à recharge à
zero-emission
l'échelle
vehicle
du pays
charging
pour
stations
les véhicules à
across.
émissions.
That is Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister and deputy prime minister, outlining some of the green plans in this budget. Certainly not the long-term greening a lot of folks had talked about with this government. We're looking at charging stations for cars. We're looking at housing retrofits, something that was very popular under the Harper government. It was actually gotten rid of because it was so popular and so expensive for the federal government. But the Liberals reintroducing that, introducing a number of infrastructure programs in this fall fiscal update, things like improving the ventilation system on public buildings as a means of creating jobs. Our David Aiken has been carefully flipping through this. David, you took a look at the highlights. We played a package from you earlier in the program on that, but take us through what were sort of the 3 big things in this that jumped out for you.
Well, first of all, even though it's a fall economic statement, it's pretty hefty. I mean, at a couple hundred pages, it's got the heft of some of the smaller budgets I've seen over the last 15 years. It's not yet a budget because I think there's a lot of what you'd say aspirational items in this particular budget. And the big one is this commitment by the government from Minister Freeland to spend, 3 or 4% of GDP on stimulus programs. That amounts to $70 to $100 billion a year starting next year. So 3 years in a row, $300 billion, but on what? We don't know. It says right in the budget, or right in the FES, it says, to be determined. We'll figure it out, but something that gets our economy going. And that's why I call it aspirational, in the sense that, the odds are pretty good that this minority government will not last through the whole lifetime of this, $100 billion a year stimulus spending. And so you can see this is being set up by the Liberals as saying, we'll put the flesh on the bones here. We're giving you a rough idea of how much we want to spend and show you we can afford to spend it, so that if there's an election next spring or even next fall, then the Liberals can campaign on this saying, see, we put something in the window and vote for us and this is what you'll get.
David, these are always inherently political documents, although this one, while there's lots of spending on the pandemic, sparse on some of those political details. Is smart move for the government the way that they're playing this?
Well, I guess, we're going to start seeing the political reaction. Couple of things. I think conservative-minded Canadians, small c conservative-minded Canadians, who are a little bit worried about the lack of spending control, and now they're introduced to this new term, fiscal guardrails, and trying to judge, whether or not some of this spending is affordable, may look at this, the 5-year forecast and say, yeah, we do have these monster deficits now, but we're going to be down to $30 billion deficits in 5 years. If that happens, that may give a little more comfort, as I say, to those conservative-minded Canadians more worried about responsible spending. Now, we do know, though, that the Liberals have been relying for their political survival in this minority parliament on the progressive parties, the Bloc Québécois and the New Democrats. And on that front, I think progressives may look and go, where's the meat? To be honest, there really isn't anything on pharmacare here. That ball is not moving very far down the road, and that's something very important to the New Democrats. If we think about a national child care program, well, there's $20 million over 5 years for a secretariat to study it. So, as I was joking in the office today, that's not child care, that's bureaucrat care. And that is not going to wash with a lot of people who are advocating national child care. So I think progressive-minded voters will look at this budget, and despite the 2 billion trees that are going to be planted, may find it a bit wanting. So from a political document for a minority government that needs somebody upon which to rest its survival, I think there's going to be some challenges ahead and possibly some more negotiations and horse trading.
David, one of the things when I'm looking at this document that's not in it is money for the provinces on health care. There is money for long-term care. There's quite a bit, and I know you can speak to that. But there is not the money that the premiers had asked for on health care. And you remember that right before the throne speech, a number of them presented themselves in Ottawa. They were in a huff. They were not happy. They wanted money for health care. They wanted more money from the federal government. They wouldn't commit to it. The Fed said, look, we've talked to the premiers. They know this isn't coming in the throne speech. This is all a political stunt. It's going to be later this fall. A lot of folks thought it would be in this fiscal update, and it's not. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so on that's very interesting. I think, Mercedes, you've hit on that this budget, as I mentioned, maybe not great for progressive voters and conservative-minded voters, but for that whole federal-provincial file, there's some question marks. And that is, of course, the big one. And the premiers, of course, weren't asking for just a small boost in the Canada Health Transfer. They're asking for something in the range of a 30 to 40% increase. And they say this is in order not just to deal with the COVID-19 crisis, but also to deal with an aging population. They're broke and they can't afford things. So that's still a hot file. And you may have noted before we came on air, before I was up here, of course, that on the other thing is a commitment to revisit, a commitment by the feds to revisit or modernize the fiscal stabilization program. That's something that Jason Kenney and Alberta have really been beating the drum on. They have felt that they have been paying too much into quote-unquote fiscal stabilization and not getting enough out. And that's probably a poor way to characterize it. Provinces don't pay into anything, they just get. But to Jason Kenney and a lot of folks in Alberta, it's seen as a program that really doesn't benefit Alberta and has continued to benefit Quebec, when in fact, Quebec's fiscal house under Premier Legault, and starting earlier with Premier Couillard, they started to get their fiscal house in order. So there's some more stuff, I think, on the federal-provincial file, ends that need to be tied up on health transfers and now on fiscal stabilization.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Something that Jason Kenney had been pushing hard for. No sectoral support for oil and gas in here. And there is sectoral support for the first time that we're really seeing for other sectors. The government had avoided doing specific sectoral support until this update. Obviously, that's changed. David, I know we'll be coming back to you for more analysis as we go through this. We're going to go now back inside the House of Commons to hear from the Finance Minister as she delivers this fall fiscal update and details exactly what the Liberals have planned for the country.
The storm. And that action has helped so much. To date, Canada has recovered almost 80% of the more than 3 million jobs lost at the outset of the pandemic. Compare that to the United States, which has recovered just over half. But there is still a lot of hard slogging ahead. First, we must defeat the virus. Only then, when the threat of lockdowns and resurgence is past, will our economy be ready for a return to full, stable, long-term growth. Canadians understand that this crisis demands targeted, time-limited support to keep people and businesses afloat and to build our way out of the COVID-19 recession. The support and investments outlined in this plan, including our stimulus, will foster a resilient and inclusive recovery. Fiscal guardrails will help us establish when the stimulus will be wound down. The government will track progress against several related indicators, recognizing that no one data point is a perfect representation of the health of the economy. These indicators include the employment rate, total hours worked, and the level of unemployment in the economy. These data-driven triggers will tell us when the job of building back from the COVID-19 recession is accomplished, and we can bring one-off stimulus spending to an end. When the economy has recovered, the time-limited stimulus will be withdrawn, and Canada will resume its long-standing, prudent, and responsible fiscal path based on a long-term fiscal anchor, which we will outline when the economy is more stable. Mais ne vous trompez pas, Monsieur le Président.
Make no mistake, Mr.
Comme nous
Speaker.
l'avons appris lors des
As we've
récessions.
learned
Well, we were hearing there from Chrystia Freeland. Of course, she's the Deputy Prime Minister and the Finance Minister. This is her first fiscal update, the fall fiscal update. A reminder again that we have not had a budget in well over 600 days. No budget in 2020, despite the historic spending. The Liberals promising there will be a spring budget that will have more on this, more details. We'll find out more about some of these programs, which the government is now characterizing in this update as a down payment on those bigger programs. We are now going to go to Daryl Bricker. He is our polling guru from Ipsos Public Affairs. Daryl, you know, you've had a chance to look at this. You're an expert at reading the pulse in this country. How do you expect this update to be received based on the pandemic spending that's in it? So some big numbers, but not as big as we thought they might have been.
I don't think people really have a sense what the right size of the numbers are. It's really the intention behind the commitments that are being made they're going to be looking for. And, you know, this government has made a really big transition in terms of the way it talks about what's going on right now. So now they're really clearly in the process of fighting day to day what's going on with the pandemic, which is exactly what the public wanted to hear. The one part that wasn't in here that they seem to be substituting something else for is real conversation about jobs. Because when you go out and you talk to people and you say, what's the most important issues facing the country today? They say fighting the pandemic, which basically they got right. But then the second part of this was unemployment, which is the thing that really stands out for the public. And it seemed to be a lot of subsidies, a lot of money going to various parts of the economy, but not a lot of specific talk about jobs and what's going to be done to protect jobs. And I think, you know, that's going to be a route in, particularly for the opposition parties.
Yeah, and there's certain jobs here that they do talk about the losses and who has taken the brunt of it. And it is new Canadians, it is Indigenous people, it is single mothers, it is young people, it is low-income Canadians, and it is racialized Canadians who are suffering the most under this. And they talk about some long-term secretariats and programs, as well as sectoral support, where a number of those people who have been so hard hit are working, because there are disproportionate numbers of those populations of Canadians in things, for example, like working in hotels, tourism, industries that have been really hard hit. And while there's money in here for those industries in the form of making loans available, making support available, a lot of those jobs are already gone. And that's one of the questions that we had looking at this, Daryl, was, okay, so how are you getting those people back to work, though? You can keep people employed whose employers have managed to hold on to them, but for those who've already been let go, how do you bring them back into the workforce? I mean, are you going to have someone who is working in a hotel going to install solar panels? Unlikely. You could retrain them, but that's not a mass transition plan. Do you think at this point politically, though, Canadians are asking those questions, or are they going to be, like the government, more focused on the immediate term, and this is really something that they can push down the road, you know, punt that can and deal with it at the earliest in a spring budget without there really being any political consequences for that?
Well, given that they've got another chance to talk about this and maybe talk specifically about what you're referring to, maybe they can do it. But exactly the question you're asking is ultimately what the vulnerability is in all of this, which is there's a lot of words, a lot of rhetoric, and by the way, something that's really associated with this government, a lot of talk. The real question is whether or not they'll be able to deliver something on that front. So you can go through, you can put the identity lens on this and talk about very specific groups. But the people who decide elections in this country, not that we're talking specifically about politics, are middle-class private sector people employed who live in the suburbs of the city and may fit into those categories, but may not fit into those categories. And it seems like, there's a real focus on really making this a sort of identity related, and that's generally not how Canadians look at these things. So there's going to be some interesting opportunities for the opposition to chip in on this and maybe put a different spin on it.
Where do you think the opposition are likely to attack based on when they're looking at the kind of polling that you do and that every party in this country, including the Liberals, is doing when they're determining what direction they want to go in? Where do you see sort of the vulnerabilities here that the NDP or the Conservatives might exploit?
Well, for the Conservatives, it's pretty clear. They'll probably go right after the point on jobs. But secondarily, for their voters, deficits actually are important. And, you can talk about guardrails, this, floors, ceilings, that, or whatever. $400 billion is a lot of money. And there isn't a lot of plans being discussed today that would really speak to that. On the other side of this, particularly the NDP, who really wants to, speak specifically about jobs and some of those communities that are going to be most affected by what's going on with the COVID crisis, particularly on the employment front, they're going to want something really specific and active in terms of things happening right now. That's what they're probably going to be demanding. So my expectation is that there's going to be a fair amount here once we get past the gloss of the rhetoric that we heard today, where the opposition parties are going to really dig in and search for details. And based on what we heard today, it doesn't seem like the government's prepared to give an awful lot of them right now.
Okay, Darrell Bricker, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your insights.
Thank you.
Let's go back to Sahir Khan now. Sahir, you have had a chance to sort of leaf through this. It's unusual this year because typically for those of you at home, we are all in a big lockup together and we bring the experts in with us and they're able to look through all these documents. So when they come out at the end of it, everybody has a sense of what's in there. Because of COVID, everybody can't be in one big room all together. So this was digital this year and it was restricted to the journalists who were looking at it, which means our experts are having to use their big brains to analyze this pretty on the fly. So here, I want to talk to you about the stimulus program, when it ramps up, when it winds down, $100 billion being committed without a lot of details on where it's expected to go. Where does it need to go and how should a program like that operate?
Yeah, Mercedes, I think this is kind of what they're articulating, about $100 billion over 3 years. It's kind of the ballpark that we were expecting. So 3 to 4% of GDP. And it puts them kind of at the upper end of the range of kind of comparable countries that are looking at anywhere from 1.4 to 4.5% of GDP. And I think the orientation is green and some infrastructure. And we don't have a lot of details. And I think our strong suspicion is those details are going to show up in the budget, which if it's anything resembling a political platform for a subsequent election, they're going to keep that powder dry for now. But I think what we were hoping for is to see a sense of direction, a sense of magnitude. And the other thing I thought was a kind of an interesting bonus here, we saw a range of scenarios presented in this document, which kind of looked at the level of stimulus and what the resulting kind of fiscal situation could be using some of the economic forecasts that they have made available to the private sector forecast. So I think it's actually a compelling document from that point of view in terms of maybe going quite a bit beyond the minimum that we might have thought that cynically that would have been produced. On the other hand, lots of details remain to be seen, and I'll leave it to your political analysts to see why that would be. But I suspect we're going to see the details in the budget.
When the document talks extensively about how quickly the economy very briefly bounced back in the summer when those COVID restrictions released, and they believe that that's due to their direct support, so they want to continue with that kind of direct support. And they argue that, in fact, that means that you really won't need that much government spending to deal with this deficit and the debt that is being incurred, that this will just kind of naturally disappear when the economy expands and GDP skyrockets, which is what they're projecting will happen, and people start spending all that money that they've saved during the pandemic if they are not the folks who lost their job, or if you are someone who qualifies for that $1,200 per child that they're looking at putting in parents' pockets to try to help out there. From the economist perspective, looking at that, how viable is that? Do we have to worry about this $1.1 trillion in debt, or is it really going to evaporate relatively quickly if the economy can rebound in the way that the Liberals are predicting they think it will?
Yeah, I think this is actually a really critical question, because I think when you think about what the minister said about things that are kind of timely targeted and temporary, I'll borrow a phrase from former Prime Minister Harper, if it's in that category and we're thinking about the quality of spend and the return on that spend to the economy, I think that's one thing. I think if the alternative scenario is we bake in a lot of entitlement programs, which are structural in nature, meaning they become permanent expenditures that impact the fiscal framework on a long-term basis. And I think it's really that mix and that's going to determine whether this increased debt that future generations are going to have to pay off is in fact not only sustainable, but is it going to be a high quality of spend? Is it going to lead to a more productive economy where the revenue coming out of that economy will get our fiscal books back in order?
And so here, we're just waiting here, and I'm actually messaging the leader of the opposition's office asking where he is, because we're expecting to hear from him at any moment. I'm just looking over here at the monitor where I can see the House of Commons feed. Chrystia Freeland is currently responding to questions being asked by Pierre Poilievre. He is the finance critic. So let's take a quick listen into that, and we are expecting a response from Aaron O'Toole shortly. He, of course, is the leader of the opposition.
To Canada first as a refugee child. He said that Canada is near the front of the line to receive 20 million doses of the COVID-19 vaccine from Moderna. And I'm quoting him, "The people who are willing to move early on with even less proof of the efficacy have assured the amount of supply they were willing to sign up to." In the case of Canada, that number is about 20 million doses. Think about that, Mr. Speaker. 20 million doses of a single vaccine. And there are 38 million Canadians. Now, I'm going to continue quoting Nubar Afeyan. He says, "The government of Canada, like others, has also reserved the ability to increase that amount, and those discussions are ongoing." So, Mr. Speaker, and this is very important in terms of building the essential confidence in each other and in our economy. We have an extensive vaccine portfolio, and this is going to make a world of difference. Mr. Speaker, let me just speak briefly about the issue of debt and deficits, and I'll say two things. It's important for Canadians to appreciate that the interest charges on our debt that we are paying right now are the lowest in a century. And the government is acting prudently to push out the maturity of that debt so that we can lock in today's low interest rates. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We've certainly heard the government make before that they are borrowing because this is historically low rates, which allows them to borrow much more without having to pay the interest on it. Let's go now to start to hear from opposition leaders as they respond to the Liberals' fall fiscal update. First of all, we're going to hear from Yves-François Blanchet. He is the leader of the Bloc Québécois, and he is speaking now on Parliament Hill.
This is Freeland, that he intends to impose conditions before coming to help those who are the most in need of some kind of support through healthcare, which is a jurisdiction of the provinces and of Quebec.
And I also wanted to follow up on the GST and HST being imposed upon international web giants. Do you think that this is a tax on companies like Netflix and Amazon, or just an extra fee for Canadians?
I do not see why any product being offered to Canadians and Quebecers should go out there without being submitted to some taxation. I don't see why. Quebec has done it for a while now. It seems to be going pretty well. And some of those huge companies have said that if Canada was to make the decision to go on with some usual, normal, and legitimate taxes, they would happily go on with it, get along with it. So I believe that all the time that we have wasted between the first moment this should have been done and next July is not only a waste of time, but a waste of a lot of money, which we direly need now.
David?
Hi, Monsieur Bonchard, bonjour. The finance minister earlier today says that this plan will help get Canadians through the winter. Do you think it's going to help Quebecers over the next couple of months?
Several things could help Quebecers through the coming months. One of them is trust, confidence, knowing that what has to be done will be done. What do we know now? We know that we will receive vaccine weeks, if not months later than most of the nations. This is a problem. We know that this government refuses blatantly to come to the rescue of the elders for whom nothing has been done. They are the most vulnerable in terms of health, in terms of being alone, being cut from the world, and in terms of pouvoir d'achat.
Power of purchase.
Power of purchase, says my wise friend. So this is what we know now. Nobody will be in a position after this crisis to say, oh, look how good we have been, us Canadian government. They have been at the best very average, and most of the time they have been late, very late, terribly late, and harmfully late.
They've been.
That is Yves-François Blanchet, the leader of the Bloc Québécois, the first of the opposition leaders that we are hearing from today. We are actually expecting to hear from Erin O'Toole, leader of the Conservative Party, shortly. Right now, Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland is in the House of Commons. She is being questioned by the finance critic, as is tradition. After the speech, each speaker faces 10 minutes of questions. Then we will hear the Conservatives' official reaction to what is in this fall fiscal update. I suspect they'll have something to say about the spending, although when we are looking at the spending so far, it is not as high as some economists had been expecting. If you're just joining us, to give you a little bit of a review of what is happening, we have now seen for the first time the numbers that this government is looking at in terms of a fall fiscal update. It is not a budget, but I can tell you that this document is as long as some of the shorter budgets that those of us who've been on Parliament Hill a while have seen. It is detailed on pandemic spending, and it is focused on really the day-to-day of this Liberal government as they try to move through the pandemic. They talk about the second wave we are currently in and concerns about business insolvencies and Canadians losing their jobs. It also talks about longer-term programs, but in very, very light terms and not deep specifics, especially when it comes to things like childcare and pharmacare, which the government is promising in this, but does not go into deep detail on. Let's go back to one of the economists who is joining us today, Trevin Stratton, who is having a chance to analyze all this. I want to go back to you, Trevin, because you've now had a chance to look a little more at this. I know it's always difficult when we're throwing 270 pages of information at you in 2 minutes and asking you to analyze it. But now that you've had, a solid 45 minutes to analyze it, what are your thoughts on what's in this document?
So I think it's important to put it in context. The last big document or event that we had from the federal government related to their plan was the speech from the throne at the end of September, where there were, there was talk about building back better, and there were a number of other initiatives that we might have not seen an update on in the fall economic statement. Right, things including reducing interprovincial trade barriers, including getting Canadians back to work and reskilling and upskilling programs for that. And the difference is what's happened in the interim is, of course, the second wave. And so I imagine the government has decided to focus very much on emergency supports for businesses and for individual Canadians in the fall economic statement, with a view towards having that larger economic recovery plan later next year as well. And so, there are some details in here, certainly some additional details when it comes to sector-specific supports that they mentioned in the speech from the throne, and also when it comes to childcare. But a lot of the initial announcements, we still don't have the details on just yet.
Trevin, you are Canadian Chamber of Commerce, so you're very aware of the pulse of businesses in this country. What do you anticipate we could be seeing in terms of a second wave and businesses that have just barely been holding on for their teeth? And, you know what? I apologize. I'm going to pause right there because I can see out the corner of my eye Aaron O'Toole, the leader of the opposition, the Conservatives, is now up in the House of Commons responding to Chrystia Freeland's fall economic statement.
Long-term plan for our economy. Without rapid testing in wide distribution, we've missed out on a critical medium-term tool, Mr. Speaker. And the Minister of Finance in her speech seems to realize that she's putting the economy on hold. She'll say, we'll rebuild the economy once COVID is beaten. Well, Mr. Speaker, rapid tests could help preserve the economy, and the vaccine will help us beat it. This government is late and has no plan for both. Canadians should see that off the start. This year has been a very difficult year for Canadians, Mr. Speaker. We all know that. 2020 will be remembered as the year a global pandemic came to our shores and took this government completely by surprise, despite many departments warning them for months. It will be remembered as a year of foreclosures, rising unemployment and uncertainty. Worse, for 12,000 Canadian families, it will be remembered as a year of grief and tragedy. Cette année a été difficile pour tous, des plus jeunes aux plus âgés. On va se souvenir d'elle comme étant l'année de la pandémie qui a pris ce gouvernement par surprise. C'est une année de fermeture d'entreprises et de chômage. Mais pire encore, c'est une année de tristesse pour les presque 2000 familles canadiennes qui ont perdu un être cher. Mais les Canadiens ont montré du courage. Ils ont respecté les consignes et ont aidé les petites entreprises. Ils ont été là pour tous leurs amis et leurs familles. Through it all, Canadians have shown courage and fortitude. They've respected directives from our health authorities. But Canadians are hurting. Canadians want their lives back. And this fall economic statement shows that they cannot rely on the Liberal government to get their lives back. Canadians are not difficult people, Mr. Speaker. They have complied, followed rules. They've tightened their belts. They're reassuring their worried children and taking care of aged parents. And to this effect, I'm really glad the Liberal government and the minister took my proposal from this spring on support for parents by boosting the Canada Child Benefit. There it was on page 10 of my leadership platform, Mr. Speaker, and I'm so glad the Liberal cabinet was reading it just as hundreds of thousands of Conservative members were.
Hear, hear. That was Leader of the Opposition, Aaron O'Toole. Of course, he's the Conservative leader with his critique so far of what is in this Liberal fall fiscal update. The first time that we have really had a chance to see the projected deficit and debt in this country and the Liberals' plans going forward, which focus almost exclusively around the immediate term with talk of recovery, talk of stimulus, but that is all down the road and without a lot of details. Before we had to jump over to the House of Commons there to hear from the Leader of the Opposition giving his response, we were speaking to our economist, Trevin, from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. I want to go back to revisit that question we were asking right when we had to jump out to Mr. O'Toole about the level of insolvency that we're expecting to see in the Canadian business community going into this second wave. What does the picture look like for Canada?
It looks very bleak for the businesses in the hardest hit sectors. So certainly, many businesses in many sectors have been able to adapt, but those really hard hit sectors that were provided with sector specific support today are looking at a pretty grim winter. Many Canadians have heard about the plight that restaurants are facing, that arts companies are facing, that retail stores are facing, and in particular small businesses. And so there are a lot of supports in place, certainly when it comes to the wage subsidy and the top up to 75%, which is what was available during the first wave, is very much appreciated by a number of small businesses, and the Canadian Chamber was certainly calling for that ourselves. And obviously the changes to the rent subsidy, since there were a number of flaws with the KECRA program, which was even demonstrated in perhaps not as large of an uptake in that program as was anticipated. But it's still going to be tougher for many businesses, simply because there are restrictions put in place. They have, for restaurants, they have very small margins. So even if they have reduced capacity, they might not, even be able to make a profit. And so it's going to be tough for the next few months for those.
Is there anything that business had asked for that wasn't included in this?
So I think certainly having a fiscal anchor or a bit more robust fiscal guardrail would be useful. I mean, there's no red line there, right? It's the government will monitor data when it comes to employment and other things to determine the fiscal outlook and fiscal capacity of the government. But certainly, looking for an actual fiscal anchor would have been useful. Certainly we saw, an announcement of new numbers on the deficit, which was useful because we haven't seen those since July. And I think there are a couple questions here. First of all spending isn't created equal. Some types of spending will have a greater positive impact on the economy and on businesses and on individual Canadians than others. And so I imagine, we're going to see a lot of that in the budget next year. And then secondly, of course, one-time deficits or emergency spending obviously makes sense to support Canadians today. The question is, whether this $100 billion that we're going to see in the budget and future budgets, will that result in structural deficits with new programs or not, is one of the questions out there too.
Trevin, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your insight and analysis.
Thanks, Mercedes.
Let's go now to our David Aiken. He is over on Parliament Hill, just outside the House of Commons, where the opposition have been keen to take a look at what's in this document and offer their thoughts on it. David, what's the reception like so far?
Well, I think that right now what the opposition politicians are doing is trying to find their hills to die on, if you will. Because don't forget, at some point in time, the government is going to have to proceed with some legislation in order to do some of the things that they've talked about here. This isn't a budget. They won't be voting on a budget, but to do some of the spending programs, they will have to present legislation to the House of Commons. That's likely not to happen until the new year, till maybe even as late as February, but then we are going to start talking into confidence votes and starting to do some deals. So as I say, as both parties, or sort of, I'll split the House up into the Conservative Party and then everybody else, the Bloc and the NDP, and we'll see where we go. I know the Bloc is really disappointed. They've been fighting hard for François Legault and other premiers on an increase in the Canada Health Transfer. They think that is very important for the federal government to do. Is that a hill that they're prepared to die on in a confidence vote? As I mentioned, the NDP, very interested in pharmacare, very interested in a national child care program, but how far are they prepared to go to force that issue? And again, the government, taking a look at the polls, Mercedes, there is broad approval so far for the way that the government has handled the pandemic and supported Canadians. Can they count on that approval staying at high levels, which may scare off some of the opposition who might want to force an election in the spring?
Yeah, and David, if this was a budget, and as much as in many ways it feels and looks like a budget, it's not. Budget requires a vote. Fiscal update, not so much. Any sense of whether the Liberals will be looking to put this one to a confidence vote?
Well, and that's a really good question. And so, I mean, we're going to have to see. As I mentioned, there are initiatives that they announced today that they would like to do that will require some legislation down the road. There's no question about that. Some of this, though, they could just wait until, and whoa, we heard this, get this, there might actually be a budget next year, budget in 2021. Remember, this parliament has gone the longest of any parliament in our history without a budget being presented to it. There hasn't been one. Remember, there was an election last fall and there's never been a budget tabled. But the government in this document talks about we'll have some more to say in budget 2021. So let's see when that happens. Typically, Mercedes, as you know, budgets have tended to be presented when there's no other reason for it to be delayed in late February, maybe early March. That's not too far off in terms of planning. And that then gets us into our election calendar for perhaps next spring. That's when people are thinking about it. And of course, the other thing is, if all goes well, we should start to see a lot of Canadians already into a vaccination program by early spring. And that could make things a lot safer for politics.
David, we have to wrap it there, but thank you so much for joining us. That's all the time we have for our special today here at Global News on the fall fiscal update. Obviously, the big news, that $382 billion deficit. We'll have more for you on Global National.
Confused at every step. Do you wonder why the Liberal government underspent on their own estimates for the wage subsidy by tens of billions of dollars while overspending on the CERB by tens of millions of dollars? They didn't have a plan to preserve the economy amid the storm of the pandemic. Millions more Canadians were put on the CERB than necessary when their jobs could have been maintained easily through an effective and swift wage subsidy. Cette approche illustre parfaitement la différence entre le Parti libéral
This approach
et le Parti
illustrates perfectly
conservateur.
the difference
Les
between the
libéraux croient
Liberal
que
Party and the
Ottawa a
Conservative
tous les
Party.
réponses,
The
elle doit
Liberals
donner
believe that
des
Ottawa
ordres.
has all the
Nous
answers
croyons
and
que
must
les
give
mesures
orders.
meilleures
We believe
solutions
that the best
arrivent
solutions
quand
come
Ottawa
when
travaille
Ottawa
en partenariat
works in
avec les gens
partnership
sur le terrain.
with people on the ground.
Un partenaire,
A partner,
pas un paternaliste,
not a
comme avec le
paternalistic
Premier ministre.
one, as with the
Mais
Prime
si au moins
Minister.
les libéraux avaient un
But
plan
if
clair.
only the Liberals had a clear
Ce qu'on
plan.
attend aujourd'hui, c'est un gouvernement
What we're
en
hearing
panique
today is a
qui brûle
panicked
de l'argent
government
pour
burning
cacher
money
son
to
incompétence.
hide its incompetence.
C'est inacceptable.
This is unacceptable.
Les Canadiens
Canadians
méritent mieux.
deserve better.
From my experience, Mr. Speaker, in both the military and in business, I know you have to learn from setbacks and failures. We must strive for excellence in what we do and promote an approach of continuous improvement. Teams do that, businesses do that, charities do that. Why does the Liberal government not do that? They haven't even learned from what they got wrong or slow in the first wave of the pandemic. We were last in line on rapid tests, Mr. Speaker, and now we're virtually last in line for vaccines. Countries with population of about 2.7 billion will be seeing the vaccine before Canadians, many this year, and we can't even get answers from this government on whether we have the logistics to receive it. The job of government in a crisis is to provide certainty, confidence in citizens that are worried, Mr. Speaker. We must provide a plan, clarity, stability, competence for those who rely on us. The upheaval we're seeing in our country lately and is in large part because of the misguided measures of this government. Late on the border, late with programs, late with rapid tests, and now late with vaccines. While the Prime Minister prefers to compare himself to the worst student in the class when it comes to the spread of COVID-19, I want Canada to strive to be the best, Mr. Speaker. That's what Canadians expect. Unfortunately, We are far from that right now. After the ongoing rapid test debacle, and this week, Canadians are learning, even today, the minister in response to her speech won't let us know which month next year vaccines will first start arriving. Our government had the duty to learn from its errors in the first wave, but instead of that, it's failed to provide vaccine for Canadians. At the same time, we'll be seeing vaccines roll out with all our allies. The Prime Minister has played the victim card. He said his government was helpless, that Canada didn't have the capability to manufacture vaccines. Now, not only is that complete rubbish, in the words of a leading scientist at the University of Ottawa, it's complete political spin, Mr. Speaker. And it also doesn't explain, well, why millions of people from Indonesia to Brazil will be receiving the vaccine before Canada will be. Again, the truth is the Liberal government was slow to respond, and they made a critical, and in sadly some cases fatal error, to put all their eggs in a basket with China, Mr. Speaker. And since the CanSino deal fell apart in August, this government has been scrambling to catch up, and they don't want anyone to know that they're months behind other countries. As I said earlier, countries with 2.7 billion people will be served before Canada. This means we're near the back of the line. While Americans are talking about mass vaccination throughout all of January, our government is only speculating about getting part of our population vaccinated by September. That means 10 extra months, Mr. Speaker, of health risks for Canadians, business closures, and economic uncertainty. Canadians want their lives back, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Health talks a great deal about the whole of government effort and the robust portfolio, but there's only one way to describe the performance of this government when it comes to vaccines. Incompetent, Mr. Speaker. Canadians, in the midst of the second wave, would rather have one dose of the vaccine in the next month than the largest portfolio 18 months from now, Mr. Speaker. Ce gouvernement libéral n'inspire pas confiance.
This Liberal government does not inspire confidence. Let's talk about its purchase of $370 million for medical gowns paid to a company with almost zero experience, or their $237 million respirator contract to their friend Frank Bayless. The We Charity scandal revealed Liberal friends who are trying to profit during a pandemic, and at a time when the trust of citizens is so important, the Liberals continue to use their donor list to choose future judges. It's one scandal after another, Mr. Speaker. Uncertainty, lack of focus, huge expenses, special treatment for their friends, and disconnection from the reality of Canadians. Those are the only ways to describe this government. But the damage is real. There are millions of people who have lost confidence and who know they've been forgotten.
This shouldn't come as a surprise, Mr. Speaker. The Canadian economy was already showing serious signs of weakness before the pandemic hit. Ignoring our warnings, the Liberals took pride in running large structural deficits and raising taxes in good economic times. Ideological policies opposed by the entire country, like Bill C-69, tanker bans, pipeline cancellations, bad trade deals, and the inability to negotiate tariff avoidance has resulted in $160 billion leaving Canada before the pandemic, Mr. Speaker. Within 2 weeks of one another, a great Canadian company, Tech, canceled a $60 billion project for our GDP out west, and the world's most famous investor, Warren Buffett, pulled out billions from a project in the east. There were already signs being sent by this Prime Minister that Canada was not open to job creation or investment. At a time we need it, Mr. Speaker, it will take a change in government to change that sign for the world, Mr. Speaker. In British Columbia, we've seen half a dozen sawmills close, and our aluminum smelter in Kitimat, one of the greenest operations in the world of its kind, they were left out to dry in both NAFTA and aluminum tariffs. Canada was already at a crossroads under the Liberals, Mr. Speaker, before the pandemic, and they are setting this country up to, for the first time in our history, pass on to our children a country with less opportunity and more division, Mr. Speaker. But it doesn't have to be that way, and I want to prove it. The middle-class values that myself and many of our colleagues were raised with, Mr. Speaker, mine in Bowmanville, Ontario, taught me to work hard, help my neighbors, and strive to be the best I could be. I was taught to learn from setbacks, never accept failure, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and get better. This led me to serve 12 years in the Canadian Armed Forces alongside some of the most exceptional Canadian citizens around. It also led me to respect the value of hard work and perseverance and the nobility in work itself, Mr. Speaker. My first job was as a dishwasher and a short order cook, Mr. Speaker, in high school. And my last job before the military was with TransCanada, inspecting pipelines, back at a time before this government when that company was still proud to have Canada in its name, Mr. Speaker. I respect people, my colleagues do, that work hard to provide for their family, whether they're a uniformed and unionized plant worker or an entrepreneur, whether they work the night shift in Mississauga, Ontario, or get up at 5 a.m. to open their small business in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. There's a nobility in that act of discipline, perseverance, and working hard for your family. We cannot lose that in this country, Mr. Speaker. We will fight hard to ensure that we never lose touch with that fundamental value upon which Canadian society has been built.
Hear, hear.
Je crois que c'est mon devoir d'être un partenaire
I
pour les
believe it is my
provinces et
duty
les
to be a
Premières
partner
Nations.
for the
Je veux
provinces
être
and
un
First
champion
Nations.
des
I
petites
want to be a
entreprises
champion
et
for small
des
business
organismes à
and
but non lucratif.
non-profit
Je
organizations.
crois en l'immense
I
potentiel
believe
de
in the
notre
immense
énergie
potential
canadienne,
of our
de notre
Canadian
bois d'œuvre
energy, our
et de
lumber,
nos minéraux.
and our
Nous
minerals.
produisons l'énergie la
We
plus
produce
éthique
the most
et la plus
ethical and
environnementale au
environmentally
monde.
friendly
Et
energy
nous voulons
in the
un plus
world.
grand
And we
engagement
want
avec les
greater
Premières Nations
engagement
pour
with First
développer
Nations
cette
to
énergie.
develop that energy.
La réconciliation doit être
Reconciliation
plus que des belles
must be
paroles, Monsieur
more
le Président.
than just
Il ne
talk,
faut
Mr.
pas
Speaker.
juste regarder
It's not
les
just
erreurs
about
du passé.
looking at the mistakes
Il
of the
faut avoir
past.
un plan réel
It's about
pour
having
le
a
futur.
real plan for
Un
the
plan
future.
qui procure de la
A
fierté
plan
et de la
that brings
richesse
lasting
durable et
pride
de
and
communautés
wealth to
trop
communities
souvent oubliées.
that are too often
Les cris
forgotten.
de la baie James,
The James
et
Bay
la
Cree
Huron-Wendat
and the
au Québec
Huron-Wendat in
sont un
Quebec
exemple
are an
pour
example
tout
for all
Canada.
of Canada.
We need to get this country working again, Mr. Speaker. Hard work emboldens the soul and builds a nation. Hard work helps families. Those families build communities and make us proud to be Canadian. Just think of Jacqueline and Barbara's 7 rooms home decor and gifts in Ocean Park, British Columbia. They bought the store just before COVID, Mr. Speaker. It's been extra tough for businesses like that. But Jacqueline and Barbara persevered, worked harder, rebranded, and they recently reopened. Congratulations, Jacqueline and Barbara. That is the Canadian spirit. They don't want more debt saddling the next generation. They just want an opportunity. They could have packed it in, but they didn't. They stayed open, they adapted, they persevered. When I questioned the Minister of Finance in the House on behalf of energy workers in Alberta, Mr. Speaker, she boasted about how many people she'd put on the CERB in that province. Albertans especially, but Canadians don't want the SERP, Mr. Speaker. They want the ability to get their lives back and to get back to work. They want a government that helps them build their livelihood in their communities rather than pushing them to close shop and move away. Because this is what it comes down to, a clash of vision between the somewheres and the anywheres, Mr. Speaker. Those who love their trade, their pursuit, and are loyal to local businesses versus those who the government wants to flock to a trendy job that is in no way connected to the community or the betterment of our country. And while this Prime Minister seems to think that every Canadian can simply work on their laptop from the local cafe, Mr. Speaker, that's not reality, nor is it what Canadians want. Conservatives are here to fight for those who build things in Canada, those who get their hands dirty and take pride in doing a job well before they come home for the night. And whether they're pulling the resources out of the ground in Canada or pulling resources out of their brain educated in Canada, we need to applaud and help them do that, Mr. Speaker. That's why we were hoping for a plan for rapid tests, for vaccine. Unlike this finance minister, I don't want the economy to crash and be rebuilt after the pandemic. I want to save it and make sure it's stronger after the pandemic, Mr. Speaker. So we are here, Mr. Speaker, for the manufacturers, the aluminum and steel industry, the small business owner, the first-generation Canadian that started a business and now hire and employ 7 other families. We're here for the farmers and the commercial fishermen, Mr. Speaker. We're here for the Indigenous entrepreneur, the working mom and dad juggling childcare and the ability to get on the GO train to go into work in the city. We're here for those Canadians that want their lives back, that want the ability to work hard and want the ability to pass on to their children a Canada that is limitless in its potential, Mr. Speaker. And they deserve a government with a vision like that, not a government that is late at every step in the worst year in our modern history.
That's right.
Les travailleurs canadiens méritent un gouvernement qui se bat pour
Canadian
eux.
workers deserve a government that fights for them. A government that is not obsessed with transitioning our industries in the midst of a pandemic, Mr. Speaker. A government that is patriotic and not afraid to fight on the world stage for rapid access to vaccines. A government that knows that Canada has an identity, a history, and that we can be proud of this.
This crisis and the rebuilding from it will take grit. It will take determination, perseverance, bold decision, but most importantly, Mr. Speaker, it will take a plan to chart our course forward. That's why it's so disappointing. After a record period without a budget, there's a stealth budget introduced today with no plan, Mr. Speaker. COVID has set us back, but COVID will not stop us. With the right ideas, with principled, ethical leaders who understand the value of a job, whether it's your first job out of school, Mr. Speaker, or your last job before retirement. With a government that will put the prosperity of all Canadians ahead of the special interests of a select few. If we have a government like this, Mr. Speaker, Canada will emerge from COVID-19 stronger, richer, and more determined than ever before. That's my mission. That's the mission of my colleagues with me here today, Mr. Speaker, and that must be our country's mission. And that's why I'm so disappointed with the Finance Minister's update today. There's no vision. There is no expression of values, including the value inherent in working Canadians. And the lack of a plan to address the most critical issues facing our country in one of the most challenging years in our country's history will only fuel the fears and uncertainties facing Canadian families across this great country. Mr. Speaker, now is not the time for experiments. Now is the time for experience. Now is not the time for building back with slogans. Now is the time we show we have our citizens' backs, Mr. Speaker.
That's right.
We need to have a plan for the challenges we face today so that our children will have the same opportunities we did tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the Leader of the Official Opposition started off by talking what will Canada be remembered by, or the government be remembered by in 2020. And I believe what the Canadians are going to remember is that in a year of a crisis, of a pandemic, a worldwide pandemic, that the Government of Canada stepped up in a very real and tangible way and worked with the provinces and territories, Indigenous leaders, the very many organizations, nonprofits, private sector, so many individuals, Mr. Speaker, with the one possible exception of the official opposition, at least in most times, and came together and recognized that we needed to minimize the negative impact of the coronavirus. And by that working together, we were able to make a difference. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Leader of the Official Opposition, does he not agree that it is the efforts by working together collaboratively that Canada has been very successful to date and will continue to be going forward because we have the right approach in terms of combating the negative impacts of the coronavirus?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the Liberal Deputy House Leader. The only collaboration I saw in the remarks today, Mr. Speaker, was the fact that the Finance Minister did adopt the childcare plan I advanced last spring, Mr. Speaker. In the spirit of Team Canada, I was a little upset she didn't thank me for the suggestions, Mr. Speaker. But if it's good for Canadian families, I'm happy with that knowledge alone. But he started off by saying, what will Canadians remember the most politically amidst the pandemic? I think on this side of the House, what we will remember most, and what a lot of Canadians will remember most and be most disappointed with, that even in a pandemic with no parliamentary oversight, there was one special line for Liberal insiders and one other line for all other Canadians. There was the We Charity scandal that they prorogued the House and have had a cover-up of historic proportions rather than answer reasonable questions about, and sole source contracts for a former Liberal MP colleague of theirs whose seat was hardly cold from having sat in this House before he got untendered contracts that the government has tried to mislead Canadians about, saying it's with another company, even though the name of the respirator is the Frank Baylis respirator. So I think that's one of the disappointing things I'll remember, rather than the Team Canada, where some of us even offered to sit on an all-party pandemic response team. There was one line for Liberal insiders and one line for all Canadians. On this side, we're going to fight for all Canadians.
Comments, questions et commentaires. Honorable député de Repentigny.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Le chef de l'opposition officielle a été de plusieurs suggestions et conseils au gouvernement pour ce qu'il aurait dû faire et pour ce qu'il devrait faire dans le futur. Alors, j'aimerais l'entendre sur une mesure qui mise de l'avant par le Bloc québécois pour peut-être arriver à réduire le déficit, soit de couper dans toutes les subventions, les crédits d'impôt et dans tout l'argent public qui est mis pour les énergies fossiles.
For fossil fuels.
Honorable chef de
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Merci pour la question, Monsieur le Président. Nous sommes ici pour tous les Canadiens et tous les Québécois et Québécoises, Monsieur le Président. Je suis fier de nos travailleurs locaux dans la région.
our work in the regions of Quebec, in the Saguenay, in Abitibi. I'm proud of our natural resources, some of the most environmentally responsible in the world. Mr. Speaker. And that's why, in the midst of a pandemic, it's time for jobs for all Quebecers and the creation of wealth, Mr. Speaker. Opportunities for all. I talked about that at my meeting with Premier Legault. I want to be a partner with the National Assembly, not a paternalist like the Prime Minister. And it's time for Quebecers to examine the Conservative Party, to take another look at us, because we are here for the benefit of all Canadians. We are here to protect French in Montreal and all across the country. We are prepared to be the next government, Mr. Speaker, and Quebecers deserve better.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for New Westminster, Burnaby.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I know the member is a student of history. He knows through the previous crises we've had strict laws against excess profits, strict laws against profiteering. And yet, in this pandemic, Canada's billionaires have added to their wealth by the tune of over $53 billion so far. Now, the papers that the government has distributed today indicate that what they intend to do eventually is to withdraw supports from people. But the PBO has said there's two alternatives. One is withdrawing supports, the other is increasing revenues. And yet, in this document, there's no wealth tax, there's no excess profits tax. The web giants who have made billions of dollars through this pandemic are not obliged to pay $1 of corporate tax. Would the member agree with us that what needs to happen is this government needs to take a strong stand against excess profits and put in place on the revenue side the kinds of things that would make a difference so that people can get the supports that they so desperately need?
Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know my friend from New Westminster, Burnaby, is addressing questions to the Leader of the Conservative Party. I'm the wrong person to suggest we need to raise taxes to, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we need to probably provide some relief to small businesses, seniors who are struggling. The problem is then that member finds it every day in question period. There are 4 parties on the extreme left of the political spectrum in Canada right now. His declining party, the Liberal government, the Green Party, and the Bloc, all on the far left. There's only one party in the center-right, la gauche radicale. There's only one party, Mr. Speaker, in the center-right, fighting for working Canadians. I'd invite that union members in his riding, take a look at the only party that supports building things in Canada, supports getting our energy and our resources to market, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to some of the corporate excesses, Mr. Speaker, I've been calling out that too, but I prefer caveat emptor, Mr. Speaker. Buyer beware. We should look at what grocery chains are squeezing suppliers when that's one of the only sectors that have seen record profits amid a pandemic. I think Canadians want to support small local businesses, suppliers that respect local farmers, local producers, aren't squeezing them, Mr. Speaker. So we don't apply big government, but we will call out, particularly in a time of crisis, what we think is not appropriate corporate conduct. And I'm very proud of our Shadow Minister of Agriculture, Mr. Speaker. After her efforts, we suddenly see this government respond, both on the grocery issue and my colleagues from across Quebec on the compensation for our farmers, Mr. Speaker, promised years ago and held up. So not only are we opposing as the official opposition, Mr. Speaker, we're proposing to get Canada back on track and build our country back stronger.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for his speech. I know that he says that he supports climate action and dealing with the climate emergency that we all voted that we were in last year. And I'd like to ask him about the proposal that the Liberals have, it's straight out of the Green Party documents, about creating a national energy grid to tie the provinces together, and noting that there was a a geyser that they hit for geothermal in Saskatchewan that could put lots of former oil drillers to work, transferring their skills as we work through a just transition and make sure that those workers have good paying jobs as we work towards the energy future and leave the fossil era behind. And I just wonder what he thinks about this proposal that the Liberals have put forward and what his ideas are in terms of clean, green energy in this country.
The Honourable Leader in the Opposition in 1 minute or less, please.
Well, Mr. Speaker, to the member from Nanaimo, Ladysmith, I actually arranged a call with the Prime Minister so I could talk about working with the incoming administration on projects, getting Keystone done, being proud of energy independence between Canada and the U.S., also looking at ways we can work together, build our economies stronger. Now, there were 2 reports issued by the Prime Minister's office of that call, Mr. Speaker. The second one is the accurate one. The first one went out before the call took place. But what I will say to that member, Mr. Speaker, is I'm proud of what we produce here in Canada. The myths that energy is going to change in the next century, you're going to see a diminishment. But the free world should be using resources from the only exporting country that has transparency, that has human rights adherence, that has environmental measures to reduce carbon intensity, that partners with First Nations. We are the environmental, social governance leaders of the world with our energy and resources, and we should promote and be very proud of that, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate. Reprise du débat, l'honorable député de
Joliette.
Oui, merci, Monsieur
yes,
le
thank you,
Président.
Mr. Speaker.
Je commencerai en disant
I'd
qu'on
like to
entend
begin
des
by
vertes et des
saying
pas mûres dans cette chambre.
that we've heard some pretty good ones here in the House today.
Là, depuis les dernières élections,
Since the last election,
on n'a pas eu de budget.
there's been no budget.
Au-dessus d'un an,
It's been over
pas
a
eu de budget
year,
encore. Là,
no
la bonne
budget
nouvelle dans
yet.
l'énoncé
And in the
économique là, d'aujourd'hui,
economic
c'est
statement
qu'on nous
today,
annonce qu'il y aurait un budget
they're
au
announcing
printemps prochain.
there'll be a budget
On a hâte
next
de le
spring.
voir.
Well, we're looking forward to seeing that.
Ça fait longtemps.
We've been asking for a budget for a long
On a eu une
time.
mise à jour cet été finalement qui était qu'un
There was
portrait
a
instantané.
summer
OK, où on
update
en
that
est,
was
qu'est-ce
just
qu'on a
a
fait comme
snapshot
dépenses jusqu'à
of
maintenant,
what the spending
c'est
has
quoi
been
l'ampleur
so
du déficit,
far,
c'est quoi nos
how big the
prévisions.
deficit
Un
is,
document utile,
how much is
mais qui
forecast.
manquait
That was a
de
useful
vision,
document, but
d'alignement
it
pour la suite des
lacked
choses.
any kind of
Puis là,
vision
ben,
or
on
alignment,
avait l'énoncé
any
d'aujourd'hui.
connection to anything
Là, on
else.
se disait, enfin, on
And
va
today,
l'avoir.
in
Enfin,
the
on va
statement, we
avoir,
thought, well, we're
ce
finally
qu'on
going to
attend.
see
Après tout,
what we're expecting. We're going to get what we want,
dans un parlement, c'est un moment
because
important
a budget is an important point in any parliament, ideally once a year, with an update in the fall, in the interim. But we have a government now that's putting Canadians deeper into debt than ever before in the past, but they didn't present any kind of a budget document today. We had high hopes for this document today, but unfortunately, like the document says itself, we've got lots of good ideas, but wait until the spring to see what we're actually doing. So it's a bit disappointing. There were 2 things that were of fundamental importance to the bloc. We had a bunch of requests. They're not that complicated. We want, we've gone out and seen families and businesses and groups. Our consultations reveal that people need this and they need that. These are their problems, and we present those here, and then we want to represent those people. We want to convey those individuals and companies' needs to the government. And if there's any consensus in Quebec, it's around funding for health care. And that's not just unique to Quebec. I think that's all across the country. In the throne speech, there was consensus among all provinces that health care needs to be better funded. And we're in the middle of a pandemic here. It's a public health crisis. And what does this document say? Not a penny for health, or basically. Yeah, that's...
Seconde. Je veux rappeler à tout le monde, I want to remind everyone in the chamber that there is a presentation being made. Someone is speaking. I just want us to respect that person. And we all want to hear what the honourable member for Joliette has to say. On veut tous entendre ce que l'honorable député de Joliette Joliette
The honourable member for Joliette has to say.
député de Joliette.
The honourable member for Joliette.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was starting to be difficult to communicate here in the House with the leader of the official opposition having a full-on conversation with one of his members. So, Mr. Speaker, it happens pretty often here in the House. When you speak French, there are a lot of people here who are unilingual Anglophones, and they just can't be bothered to listen to the interpretation. And they say, well, we don't understand it, so we'll have our own side conversations at the same time. And like the Minister for Global Affairs said, that's a lack of respect, and I thank him for his sympathy. So as I was saying, Mr. Speaker, the top priority for us is, after consulting all of our constituents, the top priority is fund healthcare. Quebec is at the very forefront of this call for better funding for healthcare. We need to catch up. We're at less than 20% of the money coming from the federal government. We'd like to see it be a little bit more than a third of the healthcare funding coming from the federal government. I think that's $28 billion more that we expect from the federal government. The reason the pandemic has hit so hard in our long-term care facilities and elsewhere is because our system was already weakened. And the question was asked recently to the Chief Medical Health Officer of Canada, and she replied, yes, indeed, the system was already weakened. And how was it weakened? It was weakened because not enough money had been invested in recent decades. That funding, or chronic underfunding, if you will, is directly attributable to the federal government's withdrawal from funding. A few decades ago, they were paying for putting basically half the bill, and then over the years it has gone down 40%, and by the end of the 90s, Canada managed to balance its books by absolutely slashing healthcare funding, healthcare transfers. And the province have been stuck ever since footing the bill. So whenever a dollar is paid in federal taxes, the provinces expect at least half of that should come back into healthcare. That's a consensus among provincial premiers. There's not a line about it in the throne speech and not a line about it in this document here, in this statement. What this document says is that we've had all these programs for the pandemic, and 80% of the money is coming from the federal government. Well, hats off to you. The money is here, and why is all the money here? It's because it's the provinces are stuck paying for the health care. Ottawa should be doing its fair share, but they copped out. And now they're sitting on pots of money here in Ottawa and leaving the provinces to struggle with rising costs. So we're saying the feds should step up and chip in at least a third of the cost of health care. And the federal government said that they were going to earmark $1 billion for long-term care, but there are going to be strings attached. There's going to be conditions, and if you meet our conditions, then we will forward the money. So you're going to have to prove that you that you respected your plans. Frankly, whose jurisdiction are we talking about here? And this is taxpayer money. It's their money, and let's respect jurisdictions. What is Ottawa doing, meddling with the way the provinces run healthcare in the field with our nurses and our personal support workers and so on? Where's the expertise? Where does it lie? It lies in the provinces, with us in the provinces. The provinces know what to do. If Ottawa were responsible for healthcare, then we simply wouldn't have public healthcare. They wouldn't be able to manage it. And now the federal government too is trying to rattle on about standards and impose standards on all this. They're going to try to centralize healthcare using standards. We're going to capitalize on your weaknesses. We're going to take advantage of this situation to pull the blanket onto our side and gain greater control over healthcare. That's unacceptable. It's a lack of respect, and it simply shouldn't be done. Mr. Speaker, there are also our seniors.
Catégorie de la population la plus vulnérable. Dans les
the most
dernières décennies, il y a eu
vulnerable
plein de programmes pour à peu près tout le monde. Puis ça, on salue ces programmes-là, évidemment. Mais nos aînés, les aînés sont restés en place.
Seniors
on les a mis de côté. On a dit non. Pendant ce temps-là, il y a l'inflation. On sait, le prix d'une chambre à résidence, puis le prix des logements, puis tout ça, ça augmente le prix de l'épicerie, ça augmente.
All their costs are going up for housing and groceries and so on. And during the election campaigns, the government said they would increase OAS, but not for those from 65 to 75. In fact, they reneged on their commitment. And they've tried to create two classes of seniors, those 65 to 75 and those over 75, by offering different benefits, different levels for the different age groups. But the pandemic has made seniors, put them in a weaker situation. Their purchasing power has gone down. And they've been completely left out here, completely forgotten. And we expected better. I'm a bit disappointed. Not just because of that. There are some good things in this document. But there's not a lot. The document says you'll have to wait until the spring, till the budget, to see what more there will be for the restart plan. But there are some little things that are worth mentioning. Taxing web giants, that's good. As of July 1st, they will have to collect sales tax. Quebec is already doing this. It's bringing revenues in, and this is good. And it takes away the unfair advantage that web giants had against Canadian-grown businesses.
Honorable député.
Point of order. Mr. Speaker, it's hard to hear what my colleague from Joliette is saying because there are other conversations going on in the House. Could members be asked to stop talking while the member is making his speech, or should we wait until they've finished talking? I think it's a lack of respect, and I'm interested in what the member for Joliette has to say. I would ask all members to whisper perhaps a little more softly. It's better than it was, but perhaps they've forgotten again. So I just ask everyone to speak a little more quietly. I know we can't get too close because of COVID-19, but if it's that important, perhaps you could leave the House for a few minutes and then come back to listen to what the honourable member for Joliette has to say. Thank you very much. The member for Joliette.
élus en cette Chambre ne parlent pas le français et donc plutôt qu'écouter la traduction via l'oreillette, font leur truc de leur côté et éventuellement se mettent à travailler, oublient qu'il y a un discours qui se fait. Malheureusement, c'est la situation pour les sous-s'exprimer en français trop souvent.
This is the unfortunate situation in which we French-speaking MPs find ourselves too often in this House. So back to what I was saying, we're disappointed that there's not enough announced for vulnerable people, such as seniors. There's not enough for health. I will also come back to the Safe Restart Agreement. Now, there are some good things, as I was saying. We're happy that they'll be taxing web giants. In the economic statement, the government has committed to levy taxes like other OECD countries. And in fact, if other OECD countries don't go ahead, then the government said it will go ahead unilaterally on its own to tax web giants. As for huge multinational corporations, well, our businesses, our mom-and-pop businesses are suffering during the pandemic. Meanwhile, Canadians are shopping online more and more. The Amazons of this world who offer e-commerce services, they are, they need to be on a level playing field with our small businesses. So we're happy to see that in the economic statement.
Ça fait 8 mois qu'on dit quand il va y avoir une relance, ça serait un bon moment là, de passer à une relance verte, stimuler l'économie.
Recovery should be a green recovery, that this is a good opportunity for the environment. The economist Jerry Rifkin,
tout ça, ça serait bien. On se serait attendu à ce qu'il y ait un début de ça dans ce document-ci.
On nous dit non,
il va y avoir un plan de relance, mais plus tard, ça pourrait être 3-4% du PIB par année pendant 3 ans. Mais on va aller consulter puis on va présenter ça plus tard. Ça sont demandé, M. le Président, si le gouvernement n'est pas en train de se ménager une fenêtre pour dire on va avoir plein de promesses éventuellement, mais ça va être lié à une élection. Donc, si vous voulez avoir tout ça, il faudra voter pour nous. En tout cas, nous,
which will be in their election platform, so they'll be able to say, you can have this commitment and this promise if you vote for us.
Monsieur le Président, on se serait attendu à davantage pour l'environnement.
Mr. Speaker, we wanted to see more measures for the environment.
Là, ben, c'est bien, on a un programme pour les rénovations éco-énergétiques dans les résidences, donc on peut aller chercher 5 000 $5,000 jusqu'à 700 000 personnes qui peuvent l'avoir. Pour les voitures électriques, ben, l'enveloppe qui était réservée à cette fin-là commençait à s'épuiser.
Retrofits.
On la rend floue, donc
That's
ça,
positive.
on salue ça, évidemment. Même chose pour les mesures pour les bombes. Et, Monsieur le Président, on nous ressort comme un vieux lapin sorti d'un vieux chapeau.
The Liberals are
c'est quoi la solution pour l'environnement? Les 2 milliards d'arbres. On va planter 2 milliards d'arbres.
The same rabbit,
là, ça va coûter
how do we solve environmental issues? We're going to plant 2 billion trees.
Avec ça, on va avoir
eventually, the government will plant 2 billion trees, and that way we'll meet all of our targets. They promised us that during the election campaign a year ago. How many trees have been planted thus far? 0 trees.
Des autres partis, il y en a eu combien d'arbres plantés sur les 2 milliards?
So
eh bien,
I put this question to the House. The 2 billion trees, how many have been planted? 0. My colleague says maybe 1 or 2 have been planted.
Donc déjà fait mieux que le gouvernement. Et si on fait un ratio,
my colleague said he himself has planted
pour 2 milliards d'arbres plantés, le gouvernement devrait verser aux leaders du Bloc québécois 1,50 $.
Should pay the Bloc québécois leader $1.50 to compensate him
encore une fois, là, il va falloir faire beaucoup plus que ça. On espère que dans le prochain budget, il y aura un vrai plan pour l'environnement. Des belles mesures, on les salue, mais c'est vraiment insuffisant.
There are some nice measures here, but they are largely insufficient.
La prolongation de la subvention salariale avec une certaine bonification, l'essentiel des mesures qui sont annoncées dans ce document-ci, ça vient bonifier la subvention salariale et ça, on le salue et c'est bien. Pendant la pandémie, avoir des mesures de soutien aux revenus, garder le lien d'emploi, c'est la chose à faire. Ça, c'est bien. Même chose pour la subvention au loyer commercial. La première formule ne fonctionnait pas, elle a été annoncée, on l'a voté cet automne, on salue ça.
Original program wasn't working well. The program was fixed. We voted for it. That's
Madame la
positive.
ministre des Finances, qu'on disait, maintenant, le gouvernement, s'il vous plaît, amenez des programmes d'aide pour les industries qui en arrachent, les secteurs qui ont de la misère. Il faut avoir des programmes ciblés, des aides ciblées pour des secteurs qui sont dans une situation particulière. On s'attendait à ça, même si ça avait filtré dans les médias, il va y avoir de quoi, enfin.
We expected to hear more
Ce qu'on nous
tonight.
dit, c'est attendez le prochain budget, il va y
But
avoir de
no,
quoi d'ici là,
we're
il
told
réfléchit.
to
Par
wait
exemple,
for
Monsieur
the
le Président,
budget. There
il y a
will
une
be
section là,
information
c'est
in the
l'aide pour
budget.
l'industrie
Here
aérienne.
is an example, Mr.
Ben,
Speaker.
il y a les mesures qui ont été annoncées pour
There's
les
some
aéroports.
text here for
Mais
about
l'industrie aérienne, c'est pas les
airlines, some
aéroports. Je
measures
rencontrais
announced
la semaine
for
passée les représentants des
airlines,
aéroports,
but
dont
airlines is not the same thing as airports.
représentant de
Last week,
l'aéroport
I met
de
with a
Montréal.
representative
Et
of the
franchement, ils en
Montreal
arrachent,
airport.
ça va mal, puis ils ont
are
besoin de
suffering.
programmes.
They are doing
Mais aussi,
very
les
poorly.
lignes
They
aériennes ont
need
besoin
targeted
d'aide. Et puis là, il n'y a
support.
rien d'annoncé là,
Airlines
malgré le titre trompeur.
need help.
On nous dit, attendez, dans le budget, il va y
Nothing is
avoir de quoi.
actually
Ça
announced
fait
here. It
longtemps,
seems
là,
like something's being announced, but
ça
no,
fait
we're
longtemps
actually
qu'on
told to
l'attend,
wait
mais
for the
plus
budget.
important que ça,
Well,
on
we've
dit
been
industrie
waiting quite a
aérienne.
while for the budget.
Le gouvernement, dans son document, réussit
It
à
says here
plugger le mot industrie
the
aérospatiale
air travel
une fois, en disant
industry
que c'est
in the
un lien avec
document.
l'industrie aérienne. Mais comme il n'y a rien pour
And we're
l'industrie
told
aérienne, il y a
that it's
encore moins
similar
rien pour
to the
l'industrie aérospatiale.
aerospace industry, but there's nothing here for the aerospace industry. Montreal is the third biggest hub city after Seattle and Toulouse for aerospace. And when we see what's happening in the U.S. and in France to support the aerospace industry, they are bending over backwards to support those industries.
Pourtant, c'est le secteur qui
the
a la plus haute valeur
ajoutée
dans l'économie.
That is a sector with incredibly high value added for the economy. They do a lot of innovation. For example, our C-Series developed in Mirabel. Now it's been bought by Airbus. It's a total gem of a sector, a gem of a business. Now the small and medium businesses are suffering in that industry. They want a specific targeted sectoral support program. And they, in fact, had to bend over backwards just to have access to the emergency wage subsidy, which they didn't originally have access to. Quebec had to stand up for them because Ottawa didn't.
On a réussi à faire changer ça,
mais là, ça prend un programme ciblé. On ne peut pas se permettre de perdre cette grappe-là. C'est le cœur de la valeur ajoutée du Québec, puis je dirais même du Canada. Il s'en fait en Ontario, il s'en fait au Manitoba, un peu ailleurs aussi, mais it also creates so many jobs in Ontario and other provinces. In order to support the sector, there has to be a vision. There's no vision, there's no information in the statement here. Now, as for tourism, there's a little bit here for tourism, but we're told again to wait because something's coming. The same goes for live events, festivals, for example, the event industry. There's nothing for them. So many sectors need help. For example, in tourism or sugar shacks, reception rooms for events. These are very specific businesses with specific situations. They need sectoral support programs. And we're told time and time again, wait for the budget. Well, that is problematic.
Donc, comme je disais tantôt aussi, même chose pour le plan de relance. Monsieur le Président, on annonce des vaccins. Je crois qu'ici,
we are hearing announcements about vaccines.
Au Québec,
here in Canada,
va regarder le train passer pour quelques semaines, quelques mois.
We're going to see what's happening for a few weeks, a few months. We're going to be behind citizens of other countries because the government was late to act.
Les nouvelles de la vaccination imminente, au moins pour nos voisins. Donc, on peut commencer à regarder une relance économique.
Neighboring countries will be vaccinated soon.
Ici, là. Ça donne de l'espoir un peu. Okay, on va s'en sortir. Ça a été dur. On en a bavé pendant des mois, mais là, avec éventuellement le vaccin, on va éventuellement s'en sortir, revenir à des conditions plus normales. Ça va nous donner, ça va être un début de possibilité de...
We see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Mais non, c'est pas de plan de relance.
Alas,
même chose, il y a un document, Monsieur le Président, j'ai bien ri quand j'ai vu ça, là, il compare quand on dit, des fois on peut faire dire ce qu'on veut aux chiffres, je ne suis pas systématiquement d'accord avec ça, mais là ici on a un bel exemple. Le gouvernement, pour se défendre là, dans sa stratégie des vaccins, ça c'est à la page 9, il montre le Canada, là, c'est le pays qui a le plus d'enfants par habitant, puis là, la dizaine ou quinzaine, vingtaine, je sais pas, environ une quinzaine de pays qui est nommé. Le pays qui fait le plus
15 other countries are cited,
alors que c'est là où se trouvent les pharmaceutiques. Donc, dans le graphique que donne, qui se retrouve dans ce document-ci, on dirait que c'est au Canada qu'il y a le plus de vaccins par population, tout ça.
It makes it seem that Canadians have the most vaccines per capita.
Alors qu'on sait très bien que la Suisse a une capacité de production de vaccins qui retrouve beaucoup de sièges sociaux, de laboratoires, de multinationales pharmaceutiques. Donc, encore une fois, ici, là, c'est
pharmaceutical companies, and they have many laboratories as well.
on va montrer qu'on a bien
The
fait,
Liberal
mais dans
government
les
is being
faits,
creative with the numbers
c'est inquiétant.
in order to show
Quand on regarde
what a good
la
job they're
docteure
doing,
Caroline
but the
Quach,
real facts, the
quand
real
elle dit,
numbers
est-ce qu'on
are
aurait-
worrisome.
Dans la question
Dr.
là,
Caroline
dont on
Quach,
parle souvent ici, est-ce qu'on aurait pu produire nous-mêmes nos vaccins? Est-ce que ça aurait pu
she
être fait au
has
Québec?
answered the question that
Au
we often
Canada,
ask in this House.
Caroline
Could
Quach
Canada
dit,
have produced its
la
own
capacité
vaccines?
de production de
Dr.
vaccins
Caroline
est
Quach
nulle.
has said that
Donc,
Canada does
il
not
s'en fait un
have
peu à
any
Toronto, à
vaccine-making
Sanofi Pasteur, où il
capacity.
y avait les laboratoires
In
communs
Toronto,
avant. Et il s'en fait
in other places,
un
there
peu
were
à
labs
Québec.
like
Et là,
Sanofi
c'est
Pasteur
GSK,
Labs
qui était,
in Quebec.
qui
There
est
was
là, sauf que c'est
GSK.
essentiellement leur capacité de production, c'est pour la grippe saisonnière, les vaccins aux enfants, et
They
puis
have
les
labs, but
vaccins
they're
pour
not
les voyageurs.
manufacturing the
Il y a eu
vaccines we need.
depuis,
They're making vaccines for
depuis,
travelers, for example, or for
les
seasonal
dernières
flu.
décennies, là, depuis les
In the
15
past few
dernières années,
decades,
au Québec, il y
in
avait
the
une
past
forte
15
industrie
years, in fact,
pharmaceutique. Il y avait
in
d'importants
Quebec, we used to
laboratoires
have
qui
a
auraient eu
really
la
strong
capacité de
pharmaceutical
produire
industry.
rapidement
We
des
had many
vaccins. Par
laboratories
l'inaction,
which would have
les
been
choix
able
politiques
to
des
rapidly reach
gouvernements
to produce
successifs ici,
vaccines.
tout ça, c'est
But
démenti.
unfortunately, successive
Je
governments
reviens un petit peu
made
en arrière,
political
Monsieur le
choices
Président.
which
En
took away
87,
that
avec le
vaccine-making
RAPNIC,
capacity.
Québec est en position de force,
During
réussit
the
à bien
80s,
travailler avec Ottawa pour mettre en place
during
tout un
the Meach
écosystème
Agreement,
qui va amener
Quebec
vraiment un
worked with
déploiement
Ottawa
important de l'industrie pharmaceutique au Québec. On va attirer 5 multinationales, il va y avoir vraiment une expertise
produced
à
a
peu
lot
près
of
2000
successful
emplois
results for
au niveau qui vont se
the
développer.
pharmaceutical
Tout ça.
industry in
Au
Quebec.
lendemain de 95, Québec n'a plus de rapport de force.
But after
Ottawa se retire.
95,
Québec essaye de mettre les bouchées
Ottawa
doubles.
pulled out
C'est
of
pas
an
suffisant,
agreement.
donc
Quebec
les
had to work twice as hard,
se
but it
déménagent,
wasn't
se
enough
délocalisent,
for the
ferment ou réduisent les
multinationals
emplois,
which
un
were in
après
Quebec,
l'autre.
so they
Donc,
shut down or they
ça va
left Quebec.
s'accélérer, ça va vraiment plus se voir dans les années 2000, mais
The effects of that
le lendemain du
became
référendum
very
où,
visible in
les
the
choix politiques
2000s.
sont mis en
The
place
year
pour
of the
que
referendum,
cette
though, in
industrie-là tombe.
95, there
Puis
were
là,
political
arrive une
decisions
pandémie, puis
here
les
in
spécialistes de la
Ottawa,
santé le disent.
which
Les
made the
pandémies, là, il
pharmaceutical
y en a
industry
beaucoup.
in
Il y a eu
Quebec
H1N1,
suffer.
il y a eu la SRAS.
We
Là,
have had
il y en a
pandemics
même
before.
des
There was
spécialistes qui disent on a été
H1N1,
chanceux,
SARS.
c'est pas un virus si
Some
mortel
experts
que ça,
have said
malgré la
that we're
catastrophe
lucky
qu'on voit,
because
vous
the
dites, ça aurait
current
pu être bien pire.
virus is
Là, on
not
apprend que le
so
gouvernement, il y a un
contagious,
an, avait
as
fait
contagious as other
détruire
viruses.
des masques, des
We have found
blouses,
out
tout ça,
that
du
a year
matériel, en
ago,
faisant fermer un
the
centre.
government
On
closed
délaissait
a
ça,
national
mais
stockpile
au
center,
niveau de l'intérêt,
getting rid
la
of
protection
hospital
de la
gowns
sécurité
and
de
masks,
l'économie,
other equipment.
laisser aller une industrie
That
de
is
pointe
very
comme ça,
unfortunate.
c'est
It is also
inacceptable. Est-ce
so
que c'est parce qu'il
unfortunate in
était au
general
Québec?
that
C'est
Ottawa
inacceptable.
let
Donc là, on aurait
Quebec's
pu, si on avait
pharmaceutical
préservé cette
industries
industrie-là, on aurait été en
disappear.
mesure de
If that
produire
industry
les
had
vaccins
been
ici
preserved and
même
maintained,
rapidement.
we would have
Mais
domestic
malheureusement,
vaccine
cet
production
intérêt-là n'a pas
capacity.
été fait.
Unfortunately,
Ça, c'est la tragédie
that is not what transpired.
de l'industrie
It is in
pharmaceutique au
fact
Québec.
a
Mais je
tragedy
dirais que
what happened to the
l'industrie
pharmaceutical industry in Quebec.
pharmaceutique en Ontario, c'est
Now, as
qui
for the
remonte un peu plus,
pharmaceutical
pour
industry
paraphraser l'autre
in
philosophe,
Ontario,
c'est quasiment une
which
farce.
has been
J'en
there a
parlais
bit
tantôt,
longer.
les laboratoires
Some
Connor,
say
qui ont été
it's not a
leaders
very
partout
serious industry.
depuis 1913, ça avait été mis sur pied, réussi à éradiquer toutes sortes de
Labs were set up starting
maladies
in
problématiques
1993.
à faible coût.
They
Les
were
laboratoires
able to
faisaient leurs
operate at
frais.
low cost.
C'était vraiment un super succès. Et,
Labs in Ontario were very successful.
Finalement reconnus partout dans le monde.
They
L'insuline
were
pour le diabète,
recognized
c'est eux
around
autres,
the
les
world.
vaccins
For
contre la
example, they
polio,
made
avec le
insulin
docteur
for
Salk, le
diabetes.
docteur
They made the
américain, ça a
polio
été,
vaccine,
c'était vraiment une
a
référence
Canadian
dans le
and
monde.
American doctor.
Puis dans
They
les
were
années
known around the
70,
world.
sous
Then,
Trudeau père,
in the
ça a été
70s,
passé à une société de développement avant d'être privatisé par
with
petits bouts, puis là être complètement
Trudeau,
sous
they
Mulroney en
privatized
89.
a lot,
Mais il y
that
avait une
was
capacité de
concluded
production de
under a
vaccins, une
Mulroney
expertise
government.
à faible coût.
Ontario
qui a été
had
délaissée. Ça, Monsieur le
vaccine
Président,
production
évidemment,
capacity
c'est
and
la
expertise
columniste du Toronto Star
and
qui a
was
fait un article
producing
là-dessus en
at
mars
low
dernier,
cost.
puis
In
qui
March, a
renvoie un
Toronto
chapitre de
Star
son livre
columnist
sur les
wrote a piece about this.
Madame Linda McQuaig, qui
Her name is Linda
parlait de
McQuaig.
ça. Donc, ça prend de la vision quand on veut développer l'économie. Là, on avait des secteurs hyper importants, hyper développés au Québec, qui auraient pu nous sortir du marasme
We
très
had
rapidement.
strong sectors
On
in
le laissait
Quebec
aller.
that could have
Puis là,
gotten
on en
us out
paye
of
les
these
frais.
economic
Là,
doldrums
quand il était le temps de
quickly.
négocier les
But
vaccins,
those
ben, on s'est
sectors were
traîné
not
les
supported.
pieds. Ils se
Then,
sont
when it
traînés les
came
pieds.
time
Fait
to
qu'on en paye les
negotiate
frais.
deals for
Puis
vaccines,
là, il y a
the
des
government
annonces de
really
montants
dragged
pour
its feet.
avoir redéployé une capacité
So
de
we're
production de
behind.
vaccins. Mais ça va être pour 2023 au mieux. Donc, ça, c'est...
Maybe by
pour cette fois-ci,
2023
c'est
we'll
pas
have
suffisant.
some
En tout cas,
domestic
souhaitons
production
qu'on apprenne
capacity.
des erreurs passées.
It's not enough. Hopefully we'll learn from the mistakes of the past and avoid repeating them. We know how difficult it is when our neighbors make choices for us and we suffer the consequences. In Quebec, we had expertise. We made vaccines. We manufactured them. But unfortunately, we lost it all. When we get the vaccine, we will be late. We will get it later than other countries. In the document, there are graphs and charts showing that Canada is ahead of everyone. Well, we may not be at the front of the pack or at the back of the pack.
Monsieur le Président, dans ce document-ci, on voulait financement de la
Here's what we wanted to
santé,
see, Mr. Speaker. We wanted to see more funding for healthcare. We wanted to see more money for seniors. The government has, in fact, committed to that. But that has been reneged on. We wanted to see more for recovery programs. We wanted to see sectoral support programs for aerospace and other suffering sectors. There's none of that. We're told to wait for the budget. It'll be in the budget. Well, once again, this is being punted down the road. There are some positive measures for the environment, eco-friendly retrofits, zero-emission vehicles. That's good, but doesn't go far enough. As for web giants paying taxes, we support that. We support levying taxes. There's another measure for stock options. Limited to $200,000. That's something. That's a step.
Évidemment, il y a une allocation familiale spéciale, donc qui n'est pas négligeable, qu'on salue.
Then there is the Canada Child Benefit. It is being boosted substantially. We support that.
Puis c'est pas mal ça.
And that's all I have to say. Oh, wait, no. In fact, I found another page of notes. There is help for those who have to work at home, those who are teleworking.
La subvention salariale qui est remontée à 75% des salaires
versés. The emergency wage subsidy, the maximum rate has been raised back up to 75% to take into account the severity of the second wave. That's good. But we're waiting for the budget. I'm not sure we're going to have to vote on this document. There are two bills at the end of the statement. We thought that there would be a Ways and Means vote at the end of the minister's speech.
Et où voter sur les